There was a team owner back in the early days of professional baseball that was business savvy, generous, flamboyant, free spending, and didn't give a crap about the game. And I think his name needs to be remembered. A few months ago, I was researching another topic involved in baseball when I came across the name Chris Vonderay. Chris Vonderay, I discovered, was the owner of the old St. Louis Browns franchise, the one that was there before the St. Louis Browns that very few people outside of baseball know of. And this guy was something else.
Vondre was a German immigrant who arrived in New York City in 1870, but he only spent a few weeks there before moving to St. Louis. He spent his time as a grocery clerk before saving up enough money to buy out the store 2 years later, and later installed a saloon in the back of the building to raise profits.
This was around the same time that professional baseball was really just starting to develop in St. Louis.
Alfred Henry Spink, the man who would later go on to create the Sporting News, founded an independent club called the Browns, and in 1881 they were submitted into the newly formed American Association, which rivaled the already established National League. Vondere, meanwhile, ran his saloon with the realization that patrons would often come in for drinks after Browns games.
Seeing this as an economic opportunity, Vonderay ended up buying $1,800 worth of shares of the Browns, making him the majority owner.
Shortly after this, Vondere signed a young ball player named Charles Comiskey, who later became the team's manager.
It was in the middle part of the decade that the Browns ran off one of the greatest championship runs that nobody talks about anymore.
From 1885 to 1888, the Browns won 4 consecutive AA championships, making the team the toast of the town. Comiskey led the way for the Browns, along with players like pitchers Bob Carruthers and Dave Fouts, who combined for 195 wins over 3 seasons.
The team even won a postseason exhibition series against the National League champion Chicago White Sox in 1886, which was huge for the American Association because at that time, the NL to the AA was like what the NFL was to the AFL before Super Bowl III. Vondere was, by all accounts, a showman as the team owner. He called himself the boss president. He would walk his team from the saloon before games, and he would buy drinks for the patrons to come into his bar afterwards.
The guy even built a second ballpark that included Wild West shows, water chute slides, a beer garden, a horse track in the outfield, and a lake that would turn into an ice rink in the winter.
He also threatened to withhold players' earnings from the 1887 World Series, a series which the Browns won. He ended up spying on his own players to make sure that they didn't go to other bars instead of his own. And he built a statue outside of the park, not of a player, not of a coach, of himself. By the end of the decade, Vondere had reportedly raked in close to $500,000 in profits from his business ventures, and things are looking pretty good.
But that all changed because of 2 big factors. One, the Browns were forced to join the National League after the American Association folded in 1891. And 2, Charles Comiskey, the golden child for Vondere, decided he'd had enough with his owner and bolted for the Cincinnati Reds, effectively putting the Browns out of contention for years to come.
It was also around this time that those in baseball decided that they'd had enough of the boss president and were trying to basically push him out of the game. And his financial issues started growing more as he sold off a lot of his good talent and the team began to suck more because he had to make profits.
After averaging more than 90 wins per season during their peak years, St. Louis never won more than 60 games in a season for the rest of Vondere's ownership. This culminated in a 39-111 finish in 1898, which is still the franchise's worst finish for a season to this date.
That final season, 1898, was what effectively led to the downfall of Vondere as the team's owner, not just because of what happened on the field, but especially what happened off of it. In one calendar year, Vondere briefly lost control of the team, had multiple deals to sell his team fall through, saw his ballpark and apartment catch on fire, he divorced his second wife by changing the locks to the apartment while she was out shopping, he remarried the housemaid that he had an affair with his first wife with, and he got kidnapped. Yep.
Okay, so the kidnapping was part of an ongoing court case that Vondere had against a former player in pitcher Mark Baldwin. Back in 1890, Baldwin went from the Browns to the then newly formed Players League and served as a sort of spokesman for the league, coercing AA players to jump ship. When the Players League folded after its 1 season of play, however, Baldwin went to the National League and again tried to get AA players to join the rival league.
Now, when Vondere found out about this, he called for Baldwin's arrest on charges of conspiracy. Baldwin was arrested and almost immediately let go free because he didn't really do anything wrong. So in turn, he sued his former owner for $10,000, a suit which Vondere lost and was forced to pay.
Now, Vonderay never paid in full because he never entered Baldwin's jurisdiction of Pittsburgh until 1894 when he was arrested and later bailed out by the president of the Pittsburgh Pirates, William Nimick. Nimick wanted to be paid back for his favor, but Vonderay kept filing appeals against Baldwin. However, in early 1898, the Supreme Court demanded that Vonderay pay off the remaining money owed to Baldwin. Vonderay would not, or maybe could not, pay off his debt, and Nimick was essentially on the hook for the payments.
This led to Nimick actually pulling off a kidnapping of Vonderay by tricking him into a stagecoach and transporting him from Missouri all the way to a Pittsburgh jail where Vonderay was eventually bailed out by his lawyers. And he still filed appeals against Baldwin until the two settled in September of '98 for about a sum of $3,000.
Now, in terms of losing control of the Browns, Vonderay resigned in January as the team's president, handing over the job to his former secretary. Hold on 1 second, let me get the name right. B.S. Muckenfuss. Throughout the season, Vonderay believed that B.S. Muckenfuss,
Yes, I am going to say his name every time.
was trying to undercut him, and the two's relationship soured. B.S. Muckenfuss somehow got control of the Browns, and Vonderay eventually filed a court motion to fight for control of the team.
In December, the courts ruled in favor of Vonderay, but the National League responded by basically undercutting him and taking the team away from him, leaving him penniless and out of a baseball club.
Vonderay was now broke, out of baseball, and only had his saloon to go back to. But business wasn't booming like it used to. For the last years of his life, the once proclaimed czar of baseball lived as a pauper, and actually was supported by his former star player Charles Comiskey, who was by this point the successful owner of the Chicago White Sox. On June 5, 1913, Chris Vonderay passed away at the age of 61. By then, the St. Louis Browns had been transformed into the St. Louis Cardinals and are still the franchise you see compete in the still-standing National League.
Now, there isn't much of a legacy to Vonderay today besides everything I've just told you. To my knowledge, there's nothing around St. Louis or any of the Cardinals facilities or Busch Stadium to honor the man.
In 2015, Vonderay was actually one of 10 finalists in the pre-integration class for the National Baseball's Hall of Fame vote for that year. However, he was not voted in. The only thing I could find connecting the Cardinals to Vonderay was a video that the team put up on YouTube about 3 years ago. At last check, the video has only around 200 views and no comments, and the only other video I found on the man was from the Bellefontaine Cemetery in St. Louis where Vonderay rests. There actually is a kind of cool part of his resting place, as the statue that once stood outside of Old Sportsman's Park is now placed in Bellefontaine.
So, why did I think this guy needs to be remembered? Well, because the guy did a lot for the game as a businessman, and some of his practices are carried out today.
In his time, he was successful, and he integrated a lot of entertainment type that we see in the sport today. The stuff like water shoots and Wild West shows are kind of similar to the pool in Arizona's Chase Field or the Ferris wheel at Comerica Park in Detroit. He did smart business-oriented things like set ticket prices as low as 25 cents so all the fans could spend the rest of their money on beer. He's even credited by some as the man who came up with the idea to sell hot dogs in the stands.
That alone should put him in Cooperstown.
And for better or worse, Vonderay was the prototype for all the big-name, brash owners and executives we've seen in baseball. Guys like Bill Veeck and George Steinbrenner followed suit in revolutionizing the sport by thinking outside the box, and all made themselves just as famous as their players. It's kind of like how there was a guy who held the home run record before Babe Ruth. Sure, the Babe was the guy who scribbled his name all over the record book because he was so dominant, but he had to write it above the guy who penned his name first.
That's what my thoughts were on this whole thing, giving a light to a guy who doesn't get it today as much. I'm not here to say whether the guy deserves the attention or not, even as it happened a long time ago, but to me, that's what kind of makes it a little more interesting. If you feel the same, thank you for watching, and I hope to see you next time.